forget. Great. Okay. I'll just quickly outline some house rules. If you could keep your mics muted for the beginning part of this session, we're going to introduce some background information about who we are as a knowledge platform, and also, of course, the Knowledge Management Fund. And then at the very end, we will for sure leave time for an open Q&A, during which time we very much encourage you to turn your cameras on if you feel comfortable, unmute your mics, and throughout the session, please just see this as an informal kind of webinar. So if you have burning questions, just raise your hand and interrupt us, or you can write your question in the chat and then we'll ask you to unmute yourself, or we'll read the question aloud for you. So just again, welcome to those of you just joining. My name is Melissa Krasenstein. I realize my name is not written, sorry, it's just written as KPSRL Secretariat. I am the Engagement and Grants Officer at the Knowledge Platform. I'm joined today by 3 of my colleagues. I'll let them quickly introduce themselves as well, and then we'll get started with a quick little poll. So maybe Messina, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, Melissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Messina Loret Manila-Kiza, and I work for the Knowledge Platform as a programming officer. Over to you, Giorgio.
Hello, everyone. My name is Giorgio. I work at the Knowledge Platform as learning officer. It's a pleasure to meet you all.
Namaste. My name is Moti Nepali from Nepal. I'm working the welfare associations with collaboration of the KMF.
Welcome, Moti. Nice to see you again. Liliana, do you think you could introduce yourself?
Yes. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. I'm Liliana Almeida. I'm Communication and Engagement Intern for KPSRL. Welcome, everyone.
Great. So we have 3 more colleagues at the Secretariat. So that makes us a total of a team of 7. They might be joining us at the very end for the Q&A. So just to get a sense in the room for how familiar you are with the Knowledge Management Fund, I'm just going to launch this poll. If you could let us know if you've received the grant before, or maybe you've applied once before, maybe you just heard about us. This will give us a sense for how in depth to go into today. Looks like okay, it wasn't even spread, but now it seems most people have recently heard about the KMF. All right, I'll end that poll. Here you can check out the results as well. So that's nice to know. That confirms our assumption that it's useful to have this kind of informational session. So other than being the donor, we also really want to offer support to our potential grantees. So what does that entail? That includes this orientation session. It includes answering any questions that you're puzzled with while developing your applications. Those of us who oversee projects as they kick off we have a very warm relationship with our grantees throughout the implementation stage as well. We also want to play a role as Secretariat to support you in connecting themes of your project to the donors of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs who support this grant, and any other projects that are being implemented in our network. We very much like to play this knowledge brokering role throughout the 9-month duration of the grant. So just quick agenda for today's informational webinar. I'll introduce a quick background and differentiate the KPSRL. There's a lot of acronyms running around. KPSRL stands for the Knowledge Platform Security and Rule of Law. And then there's the KMF, which is the Knowledge Management Fund. That's the grant mechanism that I assume all of you here today are applying for. My colleague Messina will then walk through the KMF overall application procedure with a flow chart highlighting key dates to keep in mind. Giorgio will then walk through the expression of interest form, which is the first stage of the application process. That's due on the 4th of June. Throughout this webinar, we're going to focus specifically on the earlier part of the application process, as the latter stages we'll cover later on. That's specific to those who are invited to submit a full proposal. I'll then quickly distinguish the 3 kinds of strands of grants that we offer. So there's events, innovation, and research. And then Messina will talk a little bit about the kinds of grants that the review board tends to welcome. And then I'll show you where you can find more resources on our website. And finally, of course, we'll open up hopefully about 20 to 25 minutes for a discussion to answer any questions that you have. So quick background and distinction. The Knowledge Platform Security and Rule of Law, or the KPSRL writ large, is one of 4 platforms in the Netherlands, 4 knowledge platforms. We're all close to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we respond to different policy areas of the international development of the Netherlands. Security and rule of law is one of them, and actually encompasses more broadly stabilization, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and our platform specifically looks at security and rule of law in interventions. The Dutch Development Corporation has focus countries and regions, but that does not directly apply to the KMF. So just to be clear, we very much welcome broader regional geographic knowledges and a diversity of approaches and ideas outside of the focus areas of the Dutch ministry. Besides the KMF, which is one of the funding instruments that we have another one called the Programmatic Learning Instrument, which we won't go into today. But some of our other main activities include a flagship annual conference that takes place in late October every year. I believe this year will be our 12th annual conference. Since the pandemic, it's been hybrid and historically has always been in The Hague for the in-person component. And a quick teaser that this year it might not be in The Hague, but you'll hear more about that soon. Like all of our activities, our goal is to bring together different actors in the security and rule of law sector. So what we do at the Secretariat, our role is to bring together policymakers, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and in recent years, activists and artists as well who focus on the same kinds of themes. So our network consists of our KMF grantees. It consists of partners at different Dutch embassies, and several thousand researchers and practitioners and policymakers. We organize all kinds of events throughout the year. That includes roundtables and webinars, different kinds of learning events. We also have a podcast called Fragile Truths, which later on we can share into the chat. This is our 3rd season, and we use the podcast as an opportunity to interrogate assumptions underlying in the security and rule of law sector. Sometimes our podcast features KMF grantees as well. So now diving in specifically into the KMF, it's a small low barrier grant that's consists of maximum 20,000 euros in funding. Each project lasts for 9 months in total, and every year we grant 12 projects. Historically, if you've applied before, you'll know that we had 2 windows per year. This year, I want to make very clear we only have 1 window. So this will be the only opportunity to submit an application in 2023. There's 5 of us at the Secretariat who oversee projects, including Giorgio and Messina, who are here right now. And we help you, and myself, we help you with the administrative components, but more importantly, we help you broker. We do a knowledge brokering role to make sure that your activities and the deliverables that you generate throughout your project reach interested parties and potential future collaboration, uptake opportunities on a policy level. Maybe worth mentioning is that in the last 1 or 2 years, we embarked on a journey to reform our grant, seeking to expand our applicant pool outside of Northwestern Europe, where a lot of our, when we first started, a lot of our grantees tended to come from Europe. And with these efforts, we recognize the responsibility that we had at the Secretariat to also support new applicants and just to ensure that everyone's given the best opportunity to put forth a strong proposal. So some of these efforts included, we eliminated the requirement that your project had to link to our thematic headline. So that's, as of last year, that's no longer a requirement. My colleague Giorgio will expand on that a little bit later. Previously, there was also a 20% in-kind contribution from the budget that was required, and it's no longer required if you're from a low-income country or a fragile or conflict-affected setting. We've introduced a round of interviews to provide this video interviews for an opportunity to get to know applicants more personally outside of just what's written in text. That's specific to those who are invited to submit a full proposal. Messina will expand on this stage a little bit later. And we've also made a real strong effort to simplify the language that we use in all of the documents on our website, removing jargon, to make sure that everything feels more clear and easy to understand. So that's a little bit of background for, sorry if that's redundant to some of you who already know about the grant, but for those just learning about us, I hope that that distinguishes the grant from the platform. I'm going to now stop talking and hand it over to Messina to introduce a little bit more about the application procedure. And I'll share my screen with that flow chart, Messina.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Let's now walk through the visualization Melissa is sharing to maybe clarify how the applications will be received and assessed. I think Melissa has already mentioned that this year we only have one KMF window. So let me reiterate that it's only this window. So if you want to be considered for a KMF grant, you only have this window. And I suppose you want to be considered because you're part of this conversation. Another important thing I would like to flag at this stage is that for all the key dates mentioned on our websites, applications are due by 11:59 p.m. Central European Summer Time, not after. Then delving into key dates, the call for proposal is now open since May 12th. Today, we are on the 25th, gathered for this webinar, informational webinar. And the call will remain open until 4th of June. It means that all expressions of interest are due by 4th of June. In terms of how we'll be reviewing, EOIs are reviewed and voted on separately by members of a review board. And then at a later stage, the review board meets as a group to select the best EOIs. The selection is based on the quality and the thematic relevance of the expressions of interest. I think Melissa has already mentioned at the beginning that this year, it's not mandatory to link your proposal to the thematic headline, which is the theme which each year guides the Secretariat activities. So you can, if you want, link it to the thematic headline or not. Another important point to mention with regard to the EOI stage is that in terms of feedback, we don't provide much detail at this stage. You either get invited for the next stage where you have to submit a full proposal, or you are just informed that unfortunately you can't proceed to the next stage. I'm mentioning this because later on I'll be explaining that when we release decision about full proposal, we aim to give much more details for future applications. So on 23rd of June, we will be sending full proposal invitation to those who will be invited to proceed to the next stage of the proposal. And then those full proposals will be due by July 16th. In terms of review, each proposal is normally closely read by 2 independent reviewers who discuss their assessment and produce a consolidated final score. Scoring is normally done according to a criteria scorecard, which I believe will be shared at a later stage because we think it might help in the way you build and shape your proposals. I think it's also important to mention that in case of conflict of interest, and an example of conflict of interest is a proposal, maybe either an EOI or maybe a proposal submitted by an organization closely linked in terms of governance to the Knowledge Platform Secretariat, for instance. We do have an advisory committee and a management committee, and then they step in to ensure that there is any conflict of interest in terms or any bias in terms of selection. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, at this stage, when we will be releasing decision on full proposal, we really aim to provide much more detailed feedback, indicating areas where your proposal could be strengthened for potential future applications. By the 21st of July, you will hear from us, and here I mean those who will have passed successfully the stage of full proposal. And then in between that 8th and the 4th of August, we will be organizing conversation interviews with before releasing the results. After the review of the full proposal, we try to make sure that we have conversation with all the applicants to make sure that beyond what is written on paper, we get an idea of the organization, the rationale behind submitting this proposal, and maybe how this proposal is better linked to future commitment or other activities being implemented by the applicant. And those interviews will be held between the 31st of July and the 4th of August. And then just to mention that on the 11th of August, we will be announcing KMF recipients awarded. And then in our email announcing that you have been selected, we make sure to schedule another conversation when we can delve deep into other details such as deliverables, budgets, and how the labor will be divided and the role the Secretariat will be playing. I'll stop here and I'll hand over to my colleague Giorgio, who I believe will help us understand the EOI form.
Yeah, thank you, Messina. Liliana, would you please share in the chat the link to the EOI form so that you all have it in front of you while I go through it. And oh yeah, there it is. Thank you. Yeah, so it's a very short form. It starts with the project title, and that is pretty much self-explanatory. It's just the title of your project. Then we get into something that instead requires a little bit of explanation, because the next step in the EOI form is a question that asks which sub-theme under our thematic headline does your project most connect to? Now, both Melissa and Messina have already mentioned that there is no requirement for you to connect your project proposal to our thematic headline. This is just something for us to keep track of those project proposals that are anyway fitting in the thematic headline. But there is no requirement, and also proposals are not going to be awarded additional points if they fit inside the thematic headline. So this is just for us to understand a little bit where your proposal fit, but feel no pressure at all to make your project idea fit in our thematic headline. Then just to give you an idea anyways about what our thematic headline is, I can say that it's a theme, it's an overarching theme that connects some of the things that we do throughout the year. It connects some of our KMF grants, it connects some of our webinars and events. It connects also to the annual conference in October, and also it connects at the end of the year with a so what output that tries to put together all the insights that we have generated during the year under this specific theme. And for 2023, the theme is the social contract. So by social contract, we try to find a theme that ties together everything that the people do on peace building, on addressing fragility, on working on recovery. So the idea is that the social contract is a tying point, because we assume that if these activities are successful, at some point they will have an effect in strengthening the social contract, so the relationship of consent between people and their governments, as well. And then under this broad theme, we have 3 sub-themes, and you can see them in the form. They are participatory and inclusive social contract, authoritarian social contract and the security sector, resilience to polarization. I hope that this overview is clear. If you still have questions about this, feel free to ask them later. Then we move to another closed answer question, which is, under which strands does your project mostly fall under? Event, innovation, or research? I'm not going to get into this too deeply because we have a moment later in this webinar where we discuss exactly this point. We discuss exactly what do we mean by event, innovation, research. But just here it's just important to note that you will just be asked to pick one of the 3. Then finally, we come to the substance of your project idea. The first question on the substance is described in 1 sentence what your project aims to do. So here we are really asking you to be synthetic, to be really short. To give you some examples, this could be something like, our project aims to gather the demands of Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique for anti-terrorism policy. Or it could be, we are trying to understand how the private sector could work sustainably in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Or we are trying to understand what remained of Arab Spring movements 10 or 15 years afterwards. So just a matter of be synthetic and touch on the core of your project, because then you have a little bit more space in the following and final question to explain your project idea. Here in this final question, you have 500 words, which is not a lot. I think in a page term, 500 words is probably even less than 1 page. And so again, because it's a EOI stage, we are not expecting long proposals at this stage. Again, we want really the core and the substance of your idea, and then that will be enough for us. Then what you see there that you might find a little bit confusing is that it asks you to describe how your project contributes toward network strengthening, creating opportunities for learning, and or ensuring that learning and knowledge contribute to higher quality and impact of SROL policy and programs. So this might not seem very familiar to you because this connects to our theory of change. So in our theory of change, we have the ambition of strengthen the network, create opportunities for learning, and improve the impact of SRL policy and programs. But just to explain what we mean, practically speaking, so network strengthening, this is about the people who you will involve in your project. You can say, our project is special because we are going to involve this or that actor that is important in a SROL discussion, and then you can explain why they are important. In creating opportunities for learning, here the focus is a little bit on what sort of method or what sort of opportunities you are giving people for learning. For example, it could be, we are doing research, so we are producing new knowledge. Or you could say, we are creating a space for people to discuss and exchange. Or you could say, we are We were giving the opportunity to people to stop and reflect. So all these sort of things you can capture. And then, if relevant, we are also very interested in trying to understand a little bit what sort of policies and practice your project might help improve. So, for example, you say, we're working on anti-terrorism in Mozambique, and that might help improve the African Union practice of peace building in Mozambique, for example. But you can put whatever fits. I will stop here, and I think Melissa, next is over to you, right?
Yes, sorry, just unsharing my screen here. Thank you for that overview, Giorgio. And again, if anyone has any questions about the EOI application, you can just save them either for the Q&A or already put them in the chat. There were a few questions that were already asked privately, but I think might be helpful to everyone. So when we get to the Q&A part, I'll share those as well. I just wanted to expand a bit on those three strands of grants that Giorgio briefly mentioned when we were walking through the form. So events, research, and innovation, those are the three strands that we offer. Just to note that we absolutely recognize sometimes there's some fluidity between these three strands. You might have a research project, but there might be an event component that you think is important in terms of disseminating that research at the end of the 9 months. So just please choose the one that feels most like it most encompasses what you're trying to do, but note that you won't be penalized if it fits into more than one strand. So events, and I'll share some examples of each of them from the past, but please don't feel bound to these. These are just examples. If you have new creative ideas, we totally welcome that. So event ideas that have happened in the past are like seminars, panel discussions, round tables, conferences, communities of practice that maybe are kicked off with the conference, workshops. Research tends to focus on identifying and addressing gaps in current research. Sometimes those deliverables look like policy briefs or reports. Sometimes they look like interactive web pages with different ways of accessing research components. And then innovation is, we see this as the safe space for testing, and sometimes that means failing. A big part of the Knowledge Management Fund is, the way that we define success is that you learned something from it, and that the network, the KPSRO broader network, also has access to the learning that you achieved during this 9 months. So it's a space, innovation projects are a space for testing and learning and reasonable risk taking. I know that's a pretty broad and vague definition of innovation. We tend to see a trend that some of the more techie kinds of ideas and projects sometimes fall under innovation, but not always. Sometimes it's testing out a new methodological framework. So that's just briefly on the three types of grants. And again, just choose the one that feels most like it most encompasses your idea. Ms. Nina, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about ideas that the review board tends not to select.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Melissa. So what sorts of grants do we tend to not select? We think this is important because sometimes we see proposals which are good, but which doesn't really fit with what the Secretariat aims to do or to foster via the KMF. So the first thing to emphasize is that this fund remains a fund focused on generation and brokering of knowledges and learning exchanges. It's not about implementation of activities. So it can be about how knowledges are co-created with the objective to fill gaps where there is insufficient knowledge or expertise available. It might be about connecting actors or maybe different knowledges to address a lack of awareness or maybe understanding of existing knowledges, or ensuring that actors who normally operate or tend to operate in silos can be brought together to strengthen in a much more collaborative way their efforts. It can be also about breaking down barriers for learning and change within or between people, institutions, organization, creating the right environment, as I was saying, for those stakeholders in their variety to come together and share knowledge. We also really put a high emphasis on uptake, because we do believe that beyond the production of the generation of knowledge, there is a need to make sure that that knowledge is used by the right stakeholders. So we do appreciate that you highlight, especially at a later stage in full proposals, but already in the EOIs whenever possible, some seeds of uptake to touch a little bit since the very beginning on the use of the knowledge and learning. The second point to mention is that as we've been mentioning in different interventions, you do not have your proposal doesn't have to align with this year's Secretariat thematic headlines, but it has to fall within security and rule of law umbrella. It can be initiative related to access to justice, human security, conflict prevention or resolution, inclusive governance, but it has to fall within that umbrella. What we tend to notice in EOIs and proposal is that you can sense the connection with security and rule of law, but most of the time it's quite loose, or you have the impression that the applicant hasn't really clearly or explicitly show how this falls or is connected to SRL. So we do appreciate proposals that really highlights that. Another point is about the fact that KMF funds initiatives related to fragile and conflict affected settings and low and middle income countries as defined by the World Bank. Linked to thematic priorities or maybe geographical priorities. As you probably know, the Secretariat is funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs has priority countries in terms of scope, but you are not bound to submit a proposal linked directly to those priority country scope. Finally, we want to emphasize how much the KMF is really interested in bringing wider, more diverse perspectives and sources of evidence into security and rule of law programming. And this means that we really appreciate applications showing how they will be leveraging on either community knowledge or maybe a community agency. It might be about shedding the light on indigenous knowledge or a less traditional perspective when it comes to knowledge or learning. And of course, we really encourage proposals jointly developed by different organizations at different levels across the range of security and rule of law subsectors, and with a diversity in terms of geography as well. I'll stop here and hand over to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Messina. I'm going to share my screen one more time and show you where you can find additional resources as you might have more questions that pop up, or you forget some of the things that we covered in this informational webinar. Everything that we've discussed can be found on the Knowledge Management Fund homepage. Liliana, can I ask you to also share the URL in the chat, please? So if you go to the KPSRL website, this is our overall landing page. And then you click the menu here and then Knowledge Management Fund. Again, we'll share this URL directly in the chat. This page is pretty comprehensive in everything about the KMF. If you want to find a quick way to submit your expression of interest, there's a button to link you to that right here. Here are the key dates of when you can apply. But if you scroll all the way down past my face, and then the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a bunch of downloadable PDF documents to the overview of information about the application process, frequently asked questions. Here's that web form overview that we shared while Giorgio was introducing the web form, because People find this helpful because sometimes you start the form and then you wish to return to it later. This is a nice way to avoid starting and stopping. You can just open up this overview. This is the offline application form overview for those who are invited to submit a full proposal. We did not walk through that today because it's later on in the timeline. But if you want to peek ahead of what that full proposal does entail, you can also open that up from our website. And here, again, this is for later on in the trajectory, but the criteria scorecards that the review board uses to score the full proposals can also be found here. It's not used during the expression of interest phase. During the expression of interest phase, the review board simply votes because usually we receive a pretty high volume of expressions of interest ranging between 90 to 150, up to 170, I think was the most we've received for expressions of interest. Unfortunately, we can't provide detailed feedback for those who are not selected from the EOI stage. That's a question that we get every year, is people really want to know why it wasn't selected. And unfortunately, this is simply a capacity issue. We just don't have the capacity in our team to provide feedback to such a high volume of EOIs. Those who are invited to submit a full proposal do receive very detailed feedback on their full proposal with this criteria scorecard. And everything at the bottom here pertains mostly to those invited to submit a full proposal. In the earliest stages right now, the most important things you need to look at are these top 3 documents. This is the information and application process overview. And this one is the frequently asked questions that we receive with a few helpful flowcharts. And that third one is just that EOI web form overview. So to just quickly peek ahead at what those questions will be asking. So that was a lot of listening and passive participation from you all. Now we have about 20 minutes left, if we hopefully end on time, to open up this conversation into an interactive Q&A. My colleague Giorgio will moderate this discussion. So if you have a question that you'd like to bring forward, please simply raise your hand by clicking that button at the bottom of your screen, and Giorgio will call on you. If you'd like to ask anonymously, you can also just enter those in the chat. And when there's quiet moments, I will share those questions that were asked earlier on as well. So let me hand it over to you now, Giorgio.
Thank you, Melissa. And I already see a hand raised. So Lino, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Lino from the Foundation for Justice and Development Initiatives in Uganda. Thank you so much for organizing this forum. It's very informative. I have 2 questions. The first is, do you fund research projects? And then the second question is, the grant is 200,000 and it's supposed to be competed for by, if I heard correctly, over 190 organizations apply every year. So is it possible to probably widen the grant in future to make it more, should I say, to give opportunity to more people to apply? Because it seems like it's a very small surface area and so many organizations competing for it. Yeah, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Yeah, I apologize, Lino. I didn't get your first question because you were breaking up a little bit.
I think Lino asked if we just accept research proposals. Is that correct, Lino?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we do accept research proposals. So that's an easy answer to your first question. On the second question, yeah, it is true that every year we receive lots of proposals for the KMF, and it's also true that yes, the grant is not very big; it's only up to 20,000 euros. It's just I think it's connected to the overall size of the KMF as a fund, and that is connected to the contract that we have with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the contract lasts for 4 years. So basically, until the next phase of the program, we cannot really get into that sort of discussions of expanding the pot of funding for the KMF. Do you have a different perspective on this, Melissa Messina?
No, I think that answers it pretty comprehensively, but I did hear I just wanted to make sure there's no confusion about the number. 200,000 is indeed the amount for the overall grant that we offer per year. Each individual grant can only be funded up to 20,000 euros.
Exactly.
So if you do that math, then we average about 10 to 12 projects that we fund per year, which we do recognize is very competitive. And you're not the first person to express this, so we definitely take that feedback. And as we continue to reform our grant to make it more and more accessible, I think that's a really valuable point of feedback for us to consider. We've definitely been trying to learn from other donors who have funded, for example, many more smaller amounts of funding. But as Giorgio said, our budget is stipulated in 3-year iterations, and so we can't unfortunately change our overall pot of funding at this time. But thank you for your feedback, Lino.
Yeah, and to add to that, it is also fair to say that that you are a little bit luckier than other applicants were in the past years, because just the fact that we have only one window this year, we are still awarding the same amount that we were awarding in 2022, makes very likely that there will be fewer proposals this year compared to the entire of 2022. I don't see any other hands, but maybe there are questions in the chat. I saw, for example, a question on the priority countries of the Dutch ministry. I'm not sure if it has already been answered, but
yeah, it has been already answered in the chat. I've already shared a link with much more comprehensive information, but for the moment, there are 4 focus regions: the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and the North of Africa. And within each region, there are a specific type of cooperation with specific countries, and all different countries can be found in the link I've shared in the chat. It's a long list, but you can easily see it if you click on the link I've shared.
Yeah, but just remember that even though your country is not in the list, you're still eligible.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
So I have Emily. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm sorry for the delay to switch on my camera and unmute. Thanks so much for the presentation. I have a question. It's probably partially addressed by your comment about the countries and the regional focus, but the Kismetrics Network works with a Kurdish state entity in the Kurdish part of Iraq that has been documenting evidence of ISIS crimes committed against the population in parts of the KRI. And in our work, we're trying to help them to engage with other practitioners. Well, this is one of the areas that they've been raising, but also to engage with policymakers. And I don't know whether these sorts of themes are themes that you're interested in terms of facilitating practitioner to practitioner engagement, or if you have a greater focus on perhaps research and bringing together perhaps researchers with practitioners, because through our work we have 4 or 5 different themes or areas that we think might be relevant, and we want to try and explore which one we might choose to develop for this application.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So regarding the preference for practitioner to practitioner or practitioner to policymaker, we don't have a preference there. It's just it's just a matter of how convincing your proposal is going to be on the fact that there is a learning potential, and that that your proposal will respond and build on this learning potential. And aside from that, we see a variety of configurations of learners and target audience. So don't feel restricted by any one kind of configuration.
Maybe I can just expand on that totally back what Giorgio just said, is that the project itself does not necessarily need to bring together policymakers with researchers or people across their sector, but the deliverables should be accessible and interesting to our wider network. That might include more policymakers beyond the scope of the target audience that you choose to engage in the project. So long as that can be learned from by our broader audience as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you,
Georgia, do we
Melissa.
maybe want to use the chance to bring in one of the questions from the chat as well?
I actually wanted first to go to Melissa Lee,
Other
and
Melissa, sure.
then maybe we can do that. Absolutely. Melissa, please.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Very helpful. I just had a question about the budget, because I was wondering whether we could include salaries, because I read that of course they have to be connected to the project that we are submitting basically. But yeah, just in general, if there's any further restrictions on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so normally what we see in the budget is that this budget look a little bit like a consultancy budget. So they are organized by fee rate and number of days worked. So it's not covering a salary in the way that for example, you receive your salary in your organization, but it does cover person time that is spent on this project. Indeed, yes.
Thank you.
Melissa?
This Melissa?
Did you want to go to the chat?
Sure. There was one question that I think is pretty quick for us to answer from Sonia. The question was, does the co-applicant need to be a local organization?
No, it doesn't need to, but we strongly encourage it. And it's also something that we look at very closely when assessing proposals. And we look at it, well, not necessarily in terms of the co-applicant being a local organization, because it could also be that the lead applicant is the local organization and the co-applicant is an international organization in a support role. And again, here we don't have any specific requirement or restrictions, but I think it's an honest reflection of what the review board does to say that it really takes a keen look on this from an inclusivity perspective. Okay, cool. Then I see Michelle. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi, my name is Michelle. Just a quick question. If I understood correctly, you mentioned at some point earlier in the presentation something about 20% in-kind contribution by each applicant. Could you just expand a bit more on how that would look like, and also linking to Melissa's question before, would this also be, for example, person time? So could somebody's own time be an in-kind contribution? Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for the question. And yes, indeed, it can also be person time that that is not going to be remunerated under the project. So you say, well, we propose 15 days that will be paid by the project, but then we know that what we need to to produce is going to take 20 days, and so 5 days extra are going to be our in-kind contribution. So and then that is something that we actually see often in budget proposals, and other potential in-kind contribution could be, for example, putting a space available for an event, but instead of going to rent a venue commercially, you say, we will put the space, and this is valued at a certain amount. Melissa, Messina, or maybe Christian, do you recall any other interesting examples of what applicants proposed in terms of in-kind contribution?
I think one that I tend to see pretty frequently is as simple as a venue contribution. So if it's an event, sometimes an organization might have access to a space that typically requires a certain amount. And if they can monetize that and show that as their contribution, it's really I think the purpose of the 20% in-kind contribution is for the review board to get a sense of the organization's investment in the success of the project.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And
I'll
also for the event.
Thank you for the question, Michelle, and for attending. I'm going to share in the chat also a link to this video tutorial of the budget proposal template, which might also answer some of these questions. But before I put it, I just want to note that at this stage of the application process, you don't need to focus on this. This is for those who are invited to submit a full proposal later on. But if you want to learn more about how the budget proposal works and that 20% in-kind contribution, it's also covered in this video.
Yeah, and then I see a question in the chat from Joshua that asks if East African countries are a priority. So and then say I've seen Horn of Africa and North Africa only. So again, the question on priority country is a little bit of a false dilemma, because we don't necessarily have priority countries for the KMF. But if we are talking about the Dutch Ministry for Foreign Affairs, then indeed their priority countries are framed as Horn of Africa and North Africa rather than East Africa. Then of course there is an overlap for sure, but some of the countries in the Horn of Africa that they consider priorities are Somalia, and then Sudan, and South Sudan, and Burundi, and then we start moving towards Central Africa, who then becomes DRC, or towards Southern Africa, because then becomes Mozambique.
Yeah, I feel a little bit regretful for sharing this earlier. I didn't mean to cause any confusion. I think it's only worth sharing the Dutch priority countries to understand where some of the other, outside of KMF, some of the other KPSRL focuses lie, and where there are maybe a higher concentration of Dutch funded programs or Dutch embassies. But again, to be clear, we really welcome proposals from anywhere in the world. It does not have to be a priority country.
It can help you, of course, in your proposal for uptake. If you in your proposal you have uptake for Dutch policymakers, then it's good to take into account that uptake is most possible for these focus countries.
Yeah. So basically, it's a complex answer. It's a complex answer, but then coming to Sonia's question in the chat. So the answer is no. Neither the World Bank list of fragile and conflict affected states nor the list of the ministry are mandatory. The World Bank list is only relevant for not having the 20% the 20% in-kind contribution. But it's not like only projects in countries that are on the World Bank list are funded. At the same time, if we want to go a little bit deeper, and we consider, for example, what the review board also look at. There is a certain preference for countries that are fragile and conflict affected or low income countries. But this is not a requirement, and it is also not a hard preference. It's something that it just comes up as a plus point. Yeah.
There was one question that was asked earlier in the chat that I think will be useful for people to hear. The question was, do I need to be affiliated with an organization to receive the grant? And the answer is no. You can absolutely also apply as an individual.
Exactly. Yes, Camilo, it would be possible to present EOI with a focus on Latin America. So I see that we still have 3 minutes. I don't see any other end, and also no questions in the chat. So maybe I can pass it over to you, Melissa, for closing the session.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. Just wanted to thank you all so much for joining and for asking your questions. I hope that you found this helpful. We at the KPSRL are accessible at any point. If you have any questions, you can just email kmf@kpsrl.org. I'll put that in the chat. Feel free to ask any questions that you have about the application process. Christian, we didn't get a chance to introduce you. One of our colleagues joined later on, just so you also know his face or voice. That's also fine. Maybe you want to quickly introduce yourself to everyone, Christian?
Sure, Christian Kuijten. I'm working for the Knowledge Platform since 2020 and mostly focused on the link between research and policy. So also the liaison with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thanks, Christian. I just wanted to make sure that people weren't wondering who that random voice is that chirped in. I just put a link in the chat. Would love to hear from you if you found this informational webinar helpful. I'm also going to share my screen if you're someone who would rather scan a QR code to access our survey. Thanks again for joining. Please email if you have any further questions that pop up after this informational webinar. We'll post this on YouTube for you to refer back to. And best of luck writing up your EOIs. We really look forward to reading them all. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.